Welcome to Part 1 of Ethics, the Introduction to Ethics. So a first critical question is, of course, what is ethics? And we'll begin by looking at morality and ethics. So morality, one common definition, is that it consists of the customs, precepts, and practices that deal with matters of good and bad, right and wrong, that kind of stuff. Now, when looking at ethics, one place where we start is what's called descriptive morality. And descriptive morality, as the name implies, is a description of actual moralities, typically. Essentially, the qualities of the ethics, the morality of a particular people in a particular time. And this is something that is done in the various social sciences. You might look at the history of moral views, or you might look at the sociology of moral views, or you might come across, moral values in anthropology. Now, merely going by the descriptive parts would not be philosophical. It would simply be describing the professed values of a particular people at a particular time. So if we're going to get philosophical about it, we'd have to move beyond just simply saying, these people at this time said these things about good and evil, right and wrong. So turning to ethics, one way to look at ethics is the entire realm of morality and moral philosophy. Now again, these definitions are not strict and hard and fast, and people, including myself, often use morality and ethics interchangeably, like talking about something being moral and ethical. And although some people do make distinctions, they might say something like, that's ethical but not moral, or that's moral but not ethical. But I'm not really going to get into the battles over the correct use of those terms. I'll just use them again fairly generally, which may seem kind of odd for philosophy, but, seems like a reasonable approach. Now, in the context of ethics, there are sort of three general levels of how abstract or less abstract we might want to be. At the most abstract level, there's what's called meta-ethics. You might have heard, like in the context of superhero movies and shows, the notion of meta-humans, people with abilities and powers beyond normal humans. And so meta-ethics is not like superpowered ethics with special powers. It's simply something that is the most abstract, the most theoretical part of ethics. And this typically involves investigating, creating, and assessing moral theories at the most theoretical level. And a common sort of question here might be, what is ethics? Or what is goodness itself? Or is there such a thing? Now, moving to a somewhat more concrete level, we have what philosophers call normative ethics, where we get, of course, our term, norms. We also get our term normal from that. And this is creating and applying various moral standards. So, for example, at the meta-ethic level, you might look at the question, what is goodness itself? And at the normative level, you might have, something like stealing is wrong as a standard, or one should be honest. Now, the most concrete level, and the one we typically engage with in everyday life, is what's called applied ethics. And this is, shockingly enough, the application of moral standards to specific cases or situations, where they can be fairly broad. So, for example, we may look at the general idea of, say, the ethics of, moral standards for privacy, having a right not for the people getting into your business. And then you might do applied ethics in a case, in the context of, say, social media. What sort of moral right should we have against companies like Facebook or Twitter in terms of our privacy? So when we're doing moral philosophy or ethics, broadly speaking, kind of what are we doing as a branch of philosophy? And again, if you talk to different philosophers, depending on how specific and picky and focused they are, they may give different answers. But in general, it involves the following types of stuff. First, it involves a rational and systematic attempt to understand moral terms, statements, principles, and theories, It, of course, involves analyzing those terms, concepts, principles, and theories, and involves creating them and assessing them. And then getting down to the applied level, it involves applying them to various moral problems. Now, there are many, as you might imagine, classic moral problems and classic moral questions. For example, at a fairly abstract level, there is the objective-subjective dispute. And this is the problem of determining whether ethics is objective, whether, ethics is something that is, to use an analogy, like assessing the mass or volume of something, which is an objective thing. A gallon of milk is not a gallon to you, but not a gallon to me, unless there's something, really weird going on with me. It's just it's just objectively measurable. And maybe good and evil are like that. So one approach is that ethics is objective. When you assess something as good or bad, you'd be correct or incorrect. You'd get things, accurate or not accurate. The alternative, of course, are varying degrees of relativity or subjectivity, where it's more a matter of, say, culture, or more a matter of just individual opinion. And although people tend to just sort of uncritically often think it's all just relative or subjective, that is a point of considerable debate. Is it objective or subjective? Another another abstract problem is the foundation of morality. When you talk about things being good or evil, what is it that makes something good or evil? In, say, video games and tabletop role-playing games, and movies and fiction, there can be fictional real, good and evil. They can have, powers. For example, in games like Pathfinder and some versions of Dungeons & Dragons and some video games, you can have weapons that are aligned. You can have like a sword that is infused with goodness and does extra damage to evil creatures. Or a weapon that is infused with evil and harms good creatures, more. And that there's, real powers of good and evil. Now, other views are, of course, that good and evil is set by, say, divine forces, by God. Or it could just be people are making stuff up. That ethics is just people talking about things. And we'll look at a variety of theories trying to answer that question. Now, other classic moral problems would be in the field of applied ethics. And again, this is what we tend to think about when we think about ethics, and what tends to matter to us the most. So questions like, the classic ones that are written about, over and over again in ethics classes, such as euthanasia, capital punishment, abortion, lying, stealing, and then concerns about, say, more recently, ethics of technology, things like privacy in social media, genetic engineering, genetic modification, etc. And you can make almost anything into a matter of ethics. Is this or good or bad? And it can even be simple things like, is eating say, processed food, which is, it requires a lot of, intensive use of resources, is that morally acceptable? Is, taking a newspaper that you should pay for, but, that they, you have the option to pay for it, or you can just take it for free, should you do that? Is that good or bad? And so ethics can be applied to just about anything. Now, of course, you can also cast moral problems as moral questions, like, what is good? What is evil? What is the correct life to live? Is stem cell research morally acceptable? Is abortion morally acceptable? Is it morally acceptable to use torture to combat terrorism? Are there moral rights? Is it morally acceptable to cheat on someone in a serious relationship? Is cloning morally acceptable? Is the use of automated weapon systems morally acceptable? And again, you could go on and on asking questions about, is blank good or bad? Now, when we do our assessments of ethics, we are dealing with matters of value. So moral theories tend to focus on one or more of these four main things. And as we'll see in the future, you can kind of broadly take a moral theory, look at what it focuses on, and put it in a category based on that focus. So when assessing the ethics of something, one approach is to look at the action itself. Was the action itself good or bad? Is the action something that's obligatory, that you must do, or you're bad? Or what sometimes they call supererogatory, which is kind of an odd word, but something that isn't obligatory, but actually goes beyond duty, like going the extra mile, as they would say. And so we can look at assessing actions themselves. Is, for example, killing always wrong? Or might it depend on why one is killing, the consequences perhaps, or who one is killing, perhaps. Second, of course, are consequences. This would be the outcome, the fruit of the action. So one could look at ethics in terms of weighing, say, the cost and the benefits. And we'll look at an example of this in the area of consequentialism, not surprisingly. Thirdly, people often take a focus on character, namely the virtues or vices of the person. Is the person good or bad? And of course, we also tend to consider people's motives. Why are they doing what they're doing? Do they have a good motive? Are they acting from an evil motive or neutral motive? Now, moral theories, as I mentioned, tend to pick one of these areas and really focus on that. We'll look at, for example, our good dead friend Immanuel Kant. He focuses very heavily on actions, although he does consider, character. Our good dead friend John Stuart Mill, a consequentialist, focuses on, not surprisingly, consequences. Our good dead friends Aristotle and Confucius, being virtue theorists, focus heavily on character. Now, when we're doing ethical assessment in everyday life, we tend to consider all these factors. A practical application of this would be, say, looking at a criminal trial, not from the standpoint of legality, but the standpoint of the ethics of the action. So we look at what the person did, what were the consequences, what kind of person are they, and why did they do it? And we could give different moral answers to each aspect. For example, we could have actions that seem intuitively kind of bad, but have good consequences, done by, say, a good person for good reasons. Or you could have a case where you have good actions with good consequences, done by somebody of bad character for bad reasons. To illustrate, in general, we think of an employer who treats their employees well, has a respect for diverse hiring, and doesn't, say, allow sexism and racism in the workplace as good actions. And we generally see those as typically having good consequences. But we can imagine someone who has a terrible character. Suppose they're, racist and sexist, but exceptionally greedy. And say their greed, not just simply being interested in profiting, but, greedy in the, kind of the biblical sense of the term, like the sin, that they're very, very greedy. And their motive is to make money, no matter what. And so they could, from the motive of, wanting to make tons and tons of money and avoid losing money from greed, have very enlightened hiring policies and worker policies at their company for terrible reasons. So a person could do all the right things for all the wrong reasons. You could, of course, have someone's a good person who has good motives, who does an action that ends up having terrible unintended consequences. I'd use, kind of a science fiction example, since I'm recording this during close to Halloween. You could imagine, say, a scientist who's working on a cure for, cancer, or something for treating, Alzheimer's or other conditions. And as per the usual kind of sci-fi horror movies, that instead of curing people, it ends up transforming them into zombies or terrible monsters. And again, this is sci-fi, but you have someone who is good character, good motives, who is doing actions that, like research that generally are good, but end up having terrible consequences. And to use a real-world example, you can imagine like when they're developing, say, a vaccine like the polio vaccine, you can imagine the doctors have good character and their motives are to eliminate polio, but they end up, one of the early, say, test vaccines ends up giving some people polio. And so people of good character, good motives, end up having, bad consequences. The classic case of someone for good reasons, a good person doing something that ends up having terrible results. So we can mix and match those factors. So what about keeping score of these things? Well, we keep score through the concept of value. Value, defined generically, is simply this: a measure of worth. And this includes both moral and non-moral worth. So, for example, the most obvious illustration would be monetary value. There's also things like strategic value, in terms of like military operations, political value in terms of, say, elections and so forth, aesthetic value, like whether something is beautiful as a work of art. And so there's all sorts of different categories of value. Not surprisingly, since this is an ethics class, our concern is primarily with moral worth. Now, much like batteries, value has both positive and negative aspects to it. Positive value in this context is, as the name implies, something that has a, positive worth. So that possessing it would be a gain. Negative value, of course, is the opposite. To give a circular definition, it is something, that is negative worth to it. Having it would be a loss, a harm. Now, for example, in the case of, say, business, a profit would have positive value because it's a gain. A loss would have negative value because, it's a loss. In the case of art, like aesthetics, beauty typically has positive value. If a work is beautiful, typically a gain. And if something has ugliness, that usually has negative value. It's typically a loss. In ethics, of course, the terms are pretty straightforward. Something with positive value would be good or right. Something with negative value would be evil or bad. Now, in addition to the polarities of positive and negative, value also is looked at in terms of extrinsic value and intrinsic value, although these terms are used differently in different contexts. Now, in the context of moral philosophy, here's how they're typically used. And again, there's no universal council of philosophy that decides how everything gets to be used. So extrinsic value, as the name implies, you can kind of think of it as like we get our term like external. Extrinsic value is something that is valuable because it derives its value from something else, typically as a means to an end, that it is something useful, or that it's valuable because we value it. Examples, easy and obvious examples, would be money. Money only has worth because we say it does. So if someone walks into a store with paper and hands it to the person, they can get food or guitars or a phone because we all agree mostly that it has value. But there are cases where money loses its value. In real world cases, you can have currencies collapse. The example in the United States, of course, was during the Civil War, when the money of the Confederacy eventually became, worthless. You could have a wheelbarrow full of Confederate dollars, and they might buy, nothing. Today, of course, there were something as collector's items, but because people value them. And so other examples would be medicine. We value medicine because we can get sick. If we never got sick, medicine would have no worth to us because we wouldn't need it. Education is often also seen as having extrinsic value. We learn things, say, to get a job or to get better at something in order to, perform in a better manner. Like either, because we enjoy, say, sports, getting better at a sport activity, or tying it back to work, being able to get more money. And work, of course, is also something we value because it's useful. We typically wouldn't think that work is valuable in and of itself. We value work because we get stuff out of it. Also things like gold, even though sort of like people trying to profit on fears of doomsday talk about it like how gold will have value, it just has extrinsic value. It's valuable because we value it. So if there was like a zombie apocalypse or squirrel apocalypse or zombie squirrel apocalypse, and people just didn't value gold, they say valued bullets and food more, gold would be worthless because it just has value because we were willing to accept it as valuable. So what about intrinsic value? Something has intrinsic value in a very strict sense means it's valuable in and of itself. That it's an end in itself. It's not valuable because we value it. It's valuable because it is valuable just in and of itself again. And in the case of extrinsic value, you can't be wrong about your own assessment. It's valuable to the degree that you value it. You could be wrong about someone else. You may misjudge how much somebody thinks something is worth, but in your own case, it's worth what you think it's worth, how you value it. And if something is valueless to you, then it's valueless to you. Now, in the case of intrinsic value, though, this is typically cast as an objective thing, that you could be wrong in your assessment. You could assess it and think it's, say, valueless or very valuable, but be mistaken. Now, this is much more controversial. Pretty much everyone accepts that things have extrinsic value. They are valuable because they're valued. But the more controversial matter is the view that some things just have inherent value in and of themselves, regardless of what we think about them, regardless of whether we value them or not, and that we could be objectively wrong in our assessment. To give an example of something that's supposed to have an intrinsic value would be, a person. On some moral views, the idea is that people are not just things to be valued because they're useful, say as workers, or to be exploited, or to be, as enslaved, etc. But people are inherently, valuable just for being people. Again, not as economic commodities, but they have worth as people. And our good dead friend Immanuel Kant takes this view of people. We might also look at, as an example, of love as having intrinsic value, that love should be valued and has worth, not just because people like love, but love is just in and of itself a good thing. And as I noted, the matter of intrinsic value is a matter of considerable debate. And sometimes people use the term intrinsic value less like strictly or extremely to talk about things like having kind of like worth that people would generally tend to accept. But again, if we're going to be really strict about this, and people can dispute this, extrinsic value is something, again, it's only valuable because we value it. It's essentially a thing that gets its worth from us valuing it, versus having intrinsic value, which is valuable in and of itself, where we could be wrong about that, and it just has worth. And we'll see, when we go through the various theories, we'll see these distinctions. To give two final focus examples, our good dead friend Immanuel Kant claims that objects and animals have mere extrinsic value. They're objects. They're valuable because we value them, or to the degree we value them. But for him, rational beings, people, have intrinsic value. We have worth no matter what, regardless of what people think about the worth of other people. Our good dead friend John Stuart Mill, who we'll look at in the future, he's a utilitarian, and he takes pleasure and pain to have intrinsic value. pain intrinsically bad, pleasure intrinsically good, and then everything else in the universe has mere extrinsic value. It's valuable to the degree that it creates pleasure and avoids pain. And so that brings us to the end of looking at the matter of value. In the next video, we'll take a look at the spectrum of morality. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.